Imagine a city that was the largest on the planet. A city with walls so thick that two chariots could pass side by side along their top. A city with gardens that grew suspended in the air at the height of a multi-story building. A city whose name became synonymous with luxury, sin, and human arrogance. So much so that it made it into the Bible as a symbol of downfall. This is Babylon. 2,600 years ago, this was the largest city in world history. Over 200,000 people behind walls that no army could breach. And today, a pile of broken brick in the Iraqi desert, a place tourists barely visit, part of whose ruins were driven over by tanks in 2003. And the most astonishing thing about this story isn't even that the city disappeared. What's astonishing is that it died not once, but at least twice, and both times it rose from the ashes, becoming even bigger, richer, more powerful. And then, eventually, it still turned to dust, but not at all in the way you might think. How did a city once believed eternal turn to dust? Why is the largest city on the planet known today mostly through a single line from the Bible? And why, despite Babylon falling more than 2,000 years ago, can we still not bury it for good, with disputes about it continuing even today? Let's figure it out. From the very beginning, step by step, Babylon didn't emerge out of nowhere. It stood on the bank of the Euphrates, in the very heart of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, often called the cradle of civilization. Thousands of years before Babylon, Sumerian city-states already existed here. Uruk, Eridu. The first mention of Babylon dates back to around 2300 BC. Back then, it was a small, unremarkable settlement. Everything changed with the arrival of one ruler. Around 1792 BCE, he became king of Babylon, and over the course of his reign turned the modest city into the capital of a vast empire. Hammurabi is known for one of the first written legal codes in human history, the famous Code of Hammurabi, carved into a basalt stele. The principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, comes from there. But the first Babylonian kingdom was relatively short-lived. After Hammurabi's death, the empire began to weaken, and the city passed through the hands of the Hittites, the Kassites, and the Assyrians. Yes, the Assyrians, brutal rivals from the north, destroyed Babylon almost completely on several occasions. One Assyrian king, Sennacherib, in 689 BCE became so enraged at the rebels in the city that he ordered Babylon literally wiped off the map. Walls torn down, temples destroyed, and even the course of a canal diverted so that water would wash away what remained of the city. Imagine how deliberately brutal this was. Not just burning the city, but physically flooding its ruins so that even the memory of it would be washed away by water. Sennacherib wanted Babylon to stop existing not just as a city, but as an idea. But here, for the first time, a strange pattern emerges, one that would accompany the entire history of Babylon. The city turned out to be more important than any single king, or even any single civilization. Babylon wasn't just a population center. It was the religious and symbolic center of all of Mesopotamia, the home of the god Marduk, the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon. Destroying Babylon meant challenging the gods themselves, and even the enemies who destroyed it eventually felt compelled to rebuild it, as if fearing a curse. Sennacherib's son, King Esarhaddon, literally within a few years of the destruction, ordered Babylon rebuilt to appease the gods and restore the city's status as a sacred center. It might seem like the end of the story had come and gone, but Babylon's true rebirth was still ahead. and it would become legendary at the end of the 7th century BCE. Babylon rose up against its Assyrian overlords and, allying with the Medes, destroyed the Assyrian Empire itself, the very enemy that had once wiped it off the map. The Neo-Babylonian kingdom emerged, and its most famous ruler, Nebuchadnezzar II, transformed Babylon into a wonder of the ancient world. Picture the scale. According to archaeologists' estimates, at the height of its prosperity, Babylon covered an area of about 900 hectares, making it the largest city on the planet at the time. Its population exceeded 200,000, while most cities of the era barely numbered a few thousand. The city was girded by double walls. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Babylon centuries later, wrote of walls so thick that a chariot drawn by 4 horses could turn around on top of them. Modern archaeologists believe Herodotus somewhat exaggerated the dimensions, but even by more modest estimates, Babylon's walls were among the largest fortifications of the ancient world. It's worth understanding that all this splendor wasn't built through peaceful trade alone, but also through military might. Nebuchadnezzar waged large-scale military campaigns across the Near East. It was he who, in 597 and 587 BCE, laid siege to Jerusalem twice, and the second time, after King Zedekiah's rebellion, destroyed the city utterly, burned Solomon's temple, and deported a significant portion of the Jewish population to Babylon. This event, the Babylonian captivity, would become one of the most traumatic moments in Jewish history and would leave a deep mark on the Old Testament. It is from here that Babylon's image as a city of sin and punishment originates. The resources gained through these military campaigns, tribute, captured slaves, plundered valuables, largely financed the grand construction in Babylon itself. In other words, the magnificent walls, gates, and ziggurat that so impressed contemporaries stood on a foundation of military victories and the plundered wealth of neighboring peoples. The main entrance to the city, magnificent gates covered in glazed blue brick with images of dragons and bulls. Today, a reconstruction of these gates can be seen at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. The original fragments were taken there by German archaeologists in the early 20th century. This, incidentally, will become an important plot point a bit later. It was during Nebuchadnezzar's reign that the ziggurat at Etemenanke stood in the city, a 7-tiered stepped pyramid temple, estimated at up to 90 meters tall by various accounts. Many researchers believe this very structure became the prototype for the biblical Tower of Babel, the story of how people tried to build a tower to heaven, and God punished them by confusing their languages. It's ironic that Babylon, a city that was itself a giant melting pot of cultures, languages, and peoples of the entire ancient Near East, and, of course, the most mysterious legend of all, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. According to legend, Nebuchadnezzar built them for his wife Amytis, who longed for the green hills of her native Media amid Babylon's flat landscape. The gardens supposedly rose in terraces to a height of over 20 meters, with a complex system of pumps lifting water from the Euphrates for irrigation. An important caveat is needed here. No archaeological confirmation of the Hanging Gardens' existence specifically in Babylon has ever been found. Not a single Babylonian text from that period mentions them, even though the Babylonians meticulously documented virtually everything. Some modern researchers, notably British Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, have put forward an alternative theory. Perhaps the legendary gardens actually existed not in Babylon, but 300 kilometers to the north, in the Assyrian city of Nineveh, and the story simply relocated to the more famous Babylon in later Greek retellings. A mystery we will likely never solve for certain. The Bible portrays Babylon as a symbol of debauchery and pride, the whore of Babylon. But the reality was far more complex. Babylon was a center of astronomy and mathematics in the ancient world. It was Babylonian priest astronomers who developed the base 60 number system, which is why today an hour has 60 minutes and a circle has 360 degrees. Babylonian astronomers conducted systematic observations of the sky for centuries and were able to predict eclipses and planetary movements with astonishing accuracy. The city was also known for religious tolerance by the standards of the ancient world. When Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and resettled the Jews in Babylon, the event known as the Babylonian captivity, the deportees were allowed to live in their own communities, preserve their religion, and even hold influential positions at court. It was during this period that Judaism, as a religion, largely took shape in its modern form. The economic side of Babylon's greatness is also worth understanding. The city lay at the crossroads of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean with India and Arabia. Caravans brought spices, textiles, metals, and timber here, while Babylonian merchants, in turn, developed some of the earliest known forms of banking: written contracts, interest-bearing loans, even something like checks, clay tablets that could be exchanged for goods in another city. Archaeologists have found thousands of such tablets with financial records, some of which read almost like modern accounting documents, just in cuneiform. So Babylon was simultaneously a symbol of sin in later religious texts, and one of the most developed scientific, financial, and cultural centers of its time. History, as always, is more complicated than the legend, but amid all these grand structures and legends, it's worth pausing for a moment to picture an ordinary day in Babylon through the eyes not of a king, but of an ordinary person. The city was divided into quarters by profession and status. Craftsmen, merchants, priests, and officials lived in their own districts, often tightly packed next to one another. The streets, narrow, winding, lined with one- and two-story houses made of unbaked clay brick, which, incidentally, is one of the reasons the city so easily dissolved into the earth over time. Unlike the stone structures of Greece or Rome, clay brick, under the effects of rain and wind, simply gradually turns to dust and returns to the soil it was made from. Babylon's markets thundered daily. Here they sold grain, dates, wool, metals, and spices brought from India. Women in Babylon, under Babylonian law, held a remarkable set of rights for the ancient world. They could own property, conduct trade, and under certain circumstances even initiate divorce. This stood in stark contrast to the position of women in neighboring cultures of the time. Babylon was also incredibly diverse ethnically, which is exactly why the biblical story of the confusion of tongues didn't arise by accident. On its streets one could hear Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Elamite spoken simultaneously. The city truly was a kind of ancient melting pot of cultures long before that term was ever coined for New York. 539 BCE. The Persian king Cyrus the Great stands beneath the walls of Babylon. The city is considered impregnable, enormously thick walls, provisions stockpiled for years of siege. According to the legend retold by Herodotus, the Persians managed to capture the city through a trick. They diverted the course of the Euphrates, and the water level in the river flowing through the city itself dropped enough for soldiers to walk along the riverbed straight under the walls. Modern historians treat this version with caution. Babylonian cuneiform sources, notably the so-called Cyrus cylinder, described the event differently. The city allegedly surrendered almost without a fight, with part of the Babylonian nobility itself opening the gates, dissatisfied with the rule of the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus. Either way, Babylon fell. But here's something unexpected happens, radically different from the typical conquest then destruction scenario. Cyrus did not destroy the city. On the contrary, he acted with remarkable pragmatism for a ruler of the ancient world. Cyrus declared himself the legitimate heir of the Babylonian kings rather than a foreign conqueror. He publicly honored the god Marduk, took part in local religious ceremonies, and even allowed captive peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homeland. This very decree is later described in the Book of Ezra as one of the pivotal moments in biblical history. This was a remarkably modern strategy for its time for managing conquered territories. Instead of destroying the culture of the defeated, Cyrus integrated it into his own empire, making the Persians appear to the Babylonians not as occupiers, but as legitimate successors. Babylon continued to live on, now as one of the capitals of the Persian Empire, still a large and wealthy city that Persian kings periodically visited for coronation ceremonies. The true decline would be slower and more painful than any conquest. In 331 BCE, Babylon opened its gates without a fight to a new conqueror, Alexander the Great. And here's something happens that could have changed all of world history. Alexander falls in love with the city. He plans to make Babylon the capital of his enormous empire, stretching from Greece to India. Alexander didn't just occupy the city, he actively began rebuilding it. He ordered the ziggurat at Etemenanke cleared of centuries of accumulated rubble, planning to restore the legendary tower to its former grandeur, and allocated significant resources to restore the temples. Had Alexander lived longer, it's entirely possible that Babylon would indeed have become the capital of the largest empire of the time, stretching from the Balkans to the Indus Valley. But in 323 BCE, at the age of only 32, Alexander the Great suddenly died in Babylon, probably from malaria, typhoid fever, or, according to some versions, poisoning, and the exact cause remains a subject of heated debate among historians and physicians even today, more than 2,000 years later. There is even a legend that Alexander's body did not decompose for several days, and according to one version, this is why those around him didn't immediately realize he had truly died rather than fallen into a deep coma. With his death, the dream of Babylon as the capital of the world died as well. Alexander's generals, the so-called Didakai, spent years warring among themselves over the empire's inheritance, and Babylon, symbolically, became one of the first objects of dispute. According to legend, when the dying Alexander was asked to whom he was leaving his kingdom, he faintly replied, "To the strongest," and this answer set off decades of bloody wars among the Diadochi. The empire was ultimately divided into several parts, and the city gradually lost its central political significance. What followed was a long, slow decline stretched across centuries. A new regional capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, was built nearby, and the population gradually drained toward it. Literally, house by house, family by family. Why live among old ruins when a shiny new city is rising right next door? The canals, on which all the region's agriculture depended, required constant maintenance. When centralized authority weakened, the canals fell into disrepair, fields dried up, and the territory around Babylon could no longer feed a large city. By the 1st century CE, Babylon had become a small provincial settlement amid the ruins of its former grandeur. Within a few more centuries, it emptied out completely. The desert sand gradually covered what remained of the walls, the palaces, and the ziggurat. The city that was once the largest in the world literally disappeared underground. For almost 2,000 years, only travelers and biblical texts mentioned the exact location of Babylon. Then, in 1899, German archaeologist Robert Koldewey began large-scale excavations on the mounds in the Iraqi desert. The findings exceeded expectations. Koldewey and his team unearthed the Ishtar Gate, the foundations of the ziggurat, and the remains of Nebuchadnezzar's palaces. A significant portion of the artifacts, including valuable fragments of the Ishtar Gate, were taken to Germany, where they were later reconstructed at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. This decision remains controversial to this day. Some consider it a rescue of heritage from further destruction, others call it colonial plunder, and Iraq has periodically raised the question of returning the artifacts. In the 20th century, Babylon experienced yet another, quite different resurrection. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, who saw himself as the heir to Nebuchadnezzar's greatness, in the 1980s ordered a new palace built on the site of the ancient ruins and part of the walls partially rebuilt, using Babylonian-style bricks on which, following ancient tradition, was inscribed not the name of Nebuchadnezzar, but that of Saddam Hussein himself. Many archaeologists criticize this reconstruction as having damaged the authentic remains and distorted the site's historical value. The most painful chapter of this story is the most recent one. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, American and Polish forces set up a military base on the territory of Babylon. Tanks and heavy vehicles drove right over ancient soil, helicopter landing pads were built next to the ruins, and trenches were dug through archaeological layers thousands of years old. A UNESCO report later documented significant damage, cracks in the brick of the ancient walls, destroyed sections, and the mixing of cultural layers. In 2019, Babylon finally received UNESCO World Heritage status, recognition that had been awaited for decades and which, ironically, the city had failed to obtain earlier precisely because of instability in Iraq and disputes over the authenticity of the site following Saddam Hussein's reconstructions. But this recognition came only after the city had endured wars, occupation, and decades of careless treatment. The question of returning the removed artifacts, particularly from the Ishtar Gate, remains open even today. Iraq has repeatedly raised this issue with Germany, but the Pergamon Museum argues that it was precisely thanks to their removal that the fragments were preserved in proper conditions, while the parts left in Iraq suffered far more damage from wars, erosion, and a lack of resources for conservation. This is a typical dispute in world archaeology, where the preservation of heritage ends and its appropriation begins, and Babylon is one of the most striking examples of this dilemma. Today, Babylon is an archaeological park in Iraq, visited by tourists, researchers, and pilgrims. Part of the walls has been rebuilt, though not always authentically, and one can see the foundations of the Ishtar Gate and the ruins of what is believed to be the remains of Nebuchadnezzar's throne room. But the true greatness of the city, the one that impressed Herodotus and inspired biblical authors, exists mostly in our heads, reconstructed from broken brick, cuneiform tablets, and legend. What really happened to Babylon? It didn't perish in a single instant by a conqueror's sword, as one might think. It was killed by the same thing that ultimately kills most great civilizations: shifting economic currents, decaying infrastructure, a gradual loss of relevance as new centers of power arise nearby. Babylon didn't fall, It simply stopped being needed. And yet, it never entirely disappeared. It lives on in every clock that divides time into 60 minutes, and in every circle divided into 360 degrees. The legacy of Babylonian astronomers, something most people don't even realize every time they glance at a clock face. It lives on in biblical texts read by millions of people every day, even if they've never heard of Hammurabi or Nebuchadnezzar. It lives on in language itself. When we say a Tower of Babel to mean chaos and confusion, we are, without even realizing it, referencing a city that has not physically existed for 2,000 years. And perhaps the most important lesson of Babylon's history isn't about architecture or kings, but about just how fragile any greatness truly is. A city that rose from the ashes twice after complete destruction ultimately fell not by the sword, but from the simple loss of economic reason for its existence. No empire, no city, no matter how mighty it seemed to its contemporaries, is immune to that very same scenario. Not an instant collapse, but a slow, almost imperceptible fading of relevance as the world simply moves on, leaving massive walls standing around emptiness. The city that was once the largest in the world turned to dust, quite literally. But its idea, its legend, its shadow proved sturdier than any walls, even ones thick enough for a chariot to turn around on. That if you enjoyed this story, hit like and subscribe, because more stories are coming about civilizations that vanished even from our history textbooks.